All right, buckle up for a deep dive today,
Good.
because we're tackling a topic that's heavy,
Yeah.
but incredibly relevant.
Uh-huh.
Fascism.
It's a big one.
We're going to explore its origins,
Okay.
its core principles,
Yeah.
and even see if there are any echoes of it in our modern world.
Oh, interesting.
Go ahead.
It's fascinating how a word that comes from something as simple as a bundle of sticks,
Okay.
fascio in Italian,
Right.
can represent such a complex and often destructive ideology.
It's true. You wouldn't think something so seemingly innocuous could have such a dark side. So, to kick things off, how would you define fascism for someone who might not be familiar with all the ins and outs?
Well, at its core, fascism is a far-right
Okay.
authoritarian ideology.
Got it.
That's all about extreme nationalism, centralized power,
Okay.
and often a totalitarian state.
So we're talking about a system where one person or a small group holds absolute power and controls pretty much every aspect of life.
Exactly. And this control often comes at the expense of democratic principles, like free elections, freedom of speech, and individual liberties.
Right.
Fascist regimes thrive on silencing dissent
Yeah.
and creating a society where everyone conforms to their ideology.
It almost sounds like they're trying to create a monolithic society where everyone thinks and acts the same way.
You could say that.
Okay.
And to achieve this, fascist regimes often employ a range of tactics,
Okay.
like strict censorship,
Mm-hmm.
widespread propaganda,
Yeah.
and the creation of a cult of personality around the leader.
A cult of personality. It sounds a bit like those ancient Roman emperors who declared themselves gods.
It's a surprisingly common tactic throughout history.
Really?
By portraying the leader as an almost superhuman figure, they aim to create an atmosphere of unquestioning loyalty and obedience.
It's amazing how some patterns just keep repeating themselves.
Right.
So let's get into some specific examples
Yeah.
to really understand how this played out in history. The source material mentions Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany as two of the most prominent examples of fascism in action.
Yes, and while they emerged in different contexts and had their own unique characteristics,
Yeah.
they both shared some striking similarities rooted in fascist ideology.
Okay.
Mussolini, who's considered the founder of fascism,
Right.
came to power in Italy in 1922
Okay.
and quickly established a dictatorship.
Didn't he kind of romanticize the Roman Empire and try to recapture that former glory?
Absolutely.
Wow.
He appealed to Italian nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
promising to restore Italy to its former greatness
Okay.
and build a new Roman Empire.
Interesting.
His fascist party used a mix of violence,
Yeah.
intimidation,
Oh, wow.
and propaganda to consolidate their power.
It's like he was trying to turn back the clock to a time when Italy was a superpower.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have Hitler,
Right.
who took these concepts to an even more extreme and horrific level in Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945.
His regime is a chilling example of how far fascist ideology can go.
Right.
The sheer scale of the atrocities committed under his leadership is hard to fathom.
It's a dark chapter in human history.
Ah.
The Nazis combined this intense nationalism
Mm-hmm.
with a truly abhorrent racial ideology,
Oh, wow.
ultimately leading to the systematic extermination of millions of Jews,
Right.
Romani people, and other groups deemed undesirable.
It's terrifying to think that a supposedly civilized nation could descend into such barbarity.
Yeah.
But weren't there other countries where fascism took hold,
Yeah.
even if it wasn't as extreme as in Nazi Germany?
That's right.
Okay.
The source material also mentions Franco's regime in Spain,
Right.
which had many fascist characteristics.
On it.
And even Imperial Japan exhibited some elements of fascism,
Interesting.
particularly in its militarism and expansionist policies.
So it seems like this ideology wasn't limited to one specific time or place. It
Yeah.
found fertile ground in different parts of the world. Which makes me wonder, what was it about fascism that appealed to people?
Yeah.
Why would anyone embrace such an oppressive system?
That's a complex question, and there's no single answer.
Okay.
But one key factor is the appeal to strong leadership.
Okay.
During times of crisis or instability,
Mm-hmm.
when people are fearful
Right.
or uncertain about the future,
Yeah.
they can be drawn to charismatic leaders
Got it.
who promise simple solutions and a return to order.
So it's about tapping into people's desire for security and stability, even if it means giving up some of their freedoms.
Exactly.
Wow.
Fascism often preys on people's anxieties and frustrations,
Okay.
offering scapegoats
Uh-huh.
and simplistic narratives
Right.
that blame certain groups
Yeah.
or ideologies for society's problems.
It sounds like a dangerous mix of manipulation and exploitation.
It can be.
Yeah.
But let's dive into the specifics of how these fascist regimes actually operated.
Okay.
The source material mentions that they controlled nearly every aspect of life,
Yeah.
from the media
Yeah.
to the economy.
Okay, so they weren't just about winning elections or enacting laws. They
Yeah.
wanted to control people's thoughts,
Yeah.
beliefs,
Mhm.
and even their daily lives.
Precisely.
Wow.
And one of their primary tools for achieving this was propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Fascist regimes were masters at manipulating public opinion through carefully crafted messages and imagery.
Yeah, I can see how that would be effective, especially in a time before the internet and social media when people relied heavily on traditional media sources for information.
Absolutely.
Right.
They controlled the newspapers,
Mm.
radio stations,
Yeah.
and film studios,
Right.
ensuring that the only narratives being disseminated
Uh,
were those that supported their ideology.
it's giving me major Big Brother vibes. Like something out of a dystopian novel where the government controls everything you see and hear.
It was like that.
Wow.
But it wasn't just about propaganda, right?
Right.
They also used more brutal methods to silence dissent.
So speaking your mind could land you in some serious trouble.
Absolutely.
Wow.
They employed secret police forces, extensive surveillance networks,
it.
and harsh punishments,
Okay.
including imprisonment,
Uh-huh.
exile,
Wow.
and even execution
Wow.
to suppress any challenge to their authority.
It's a chilling reminder of how fragile freedom can be
Yeah,
and how easily it can be eroded when people are afraid to speak out against injustice.
that's right.
It makes me wonder, how did they control the economy?
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Did they follow a strict socialist model
Mm-hmm.
or a more capitalist approach?
Yeah.
Fascist economic policies were a bit of a hybrid.
Okay.
While they weren't strictly socialist in the sense of abolishing private property,
Right.
they did involve significant state intervention and control.
So it wasn't a completely hands-off approach.
Right.
Like a pure capitalist system.
Not at all.
Interesting.
They directed resources towards specific industries and projects
Mhm.
that aligned with their nationalistic goals,
Okay.
like military expansion
Right.
and large-scale infrastructure projects.
Got it.
They often formed close relationships with big businesses,
Yeah.
creating a system where corporations benefited from state support in exchange for their loyalty to the regime.
So it was more about using the economy as a tool
Mhm.
to strengthen the state and achieve their political objectives.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this often came at the expense of individual economic freedom
Uh-huh.
and could lead to corruption and inefficiency.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster in the long run.
It often was.
Yeah.
But in the short term, these policies could sometimes create an illusion of economic progress,
Okay.
especially when combined with aggressive nationalist propaganda.
So it was all about creating a facade of strength and prosperity,
Mm.
even if it wasn't sustainable. It's fascinating and a little scary to see how these regimes managed to manipulate and control so many aspects of society.
Uh-huh.
But now I'm curious about the long-term consequences of this ideology.
Okay.
I mean, suppressing freedoms and human rights can't lead to anything good.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
The inherent rejection of individual liberties
Yeah.
and the reliance on violence and oppression in fascist regimes
Right.
inevitably led to widespread human rights abuses and suffering.
And didn't their aggressive expansionist policies play a major role in triggering World War II?
They certainly did.
Wow.
The emphasis on militarism and nationalistic fervor, combined with the desire to restore past glories and reclaim lost territories, fueled their expansionist ambitions and ultimately contributed to the outbreak of one of the most devastating conflicts in human history.
It's a stark reminder of the dangers of allowing nationalist extremism and militaristic ideology to take hold.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And beyond the human cost of war,
Mm-hmm.
these regimes often faced economic instability in the long run.
Okay.
Their centralized control and focus on short-term gains often led to inefficiencies, corruption,
Yeah.
and ultimately economic stagnation.
So it wasn't just a moral failure, but also a practical one.
Exactly.
Wow.
And perhaps the most devastating consequence of fascist ideology
Okay.
was the dehumanization of entire groups of people.
Yeah.
This led to horrific atrocities like genocide and ethnic cleansing, leaving scars that continue to haunt us today.
It's a sobering reminder of the dark side of human nature
Ah,
and the importance of safeguarding our values and institutions against extremism and intolerance.
it is.
But I'm wondering, do we see any echoes of these dangerous ideologies in the modern world? It feels like a sensitive topic,
It is.
but I think it's important to explore.
You're right, it is.
I've been noticing a rise in populist nationalism
Hmm.
in various parts of the world,
Yeah.
and it seems like some of the rhetoric and tactics employed by these movements
Right.
have echoes of fascism.
That's a keen observation.
Okay.
We'll delve into those modern-day parallels
Okay.
in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
All right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah.
From the historical origins of fascism
Mm-hmm.
to its core tenets
Uh-huh.
and devastating consequences.
We have. It's been a fascinating, if somewhat disturbing, journey through history.
Definitely. It's eye-opening to see how these patterns of authoritarianism have played out over time. But now I'm really curious to explore those modern echoes of fascism you mentioned.
Right.
Where do we see those popping up today?
Well, as you pointed out, the rise of populist nationalism is one area where we see some parallels. These movements often appeal to a sense of national identity and pride,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes tinged with resentment or a feeling of being left behind by the elites.
I've noticed that. It's like they tap into this idea that the nation is somehow under threat, whether from globalization, immigration, or some other external force.
Right.
And they promise to restore the nation to its former greatness,
Yeah.
often by taking a hard line against those perceived as outsiders or enemies.
That's a key element.
Okay.
And this rhetoric can be very effective,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in times of economic uncertainty or social upheaval.
Right.
People are looking for simple answers and strong leaders who promise to protect them from these perceived threats.
It's almost like a psychological need for security and belonging, right? People want to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, and these movements offer them that sense of community and shared purpose.
Exactly. But the danger is that this unity often comes at the expense of tolerance and inclusivity.
Right.
It's about drawing sharp distinctions between us and them,
Wow.
creating an atmosphere of suspicion and hostility toward anyone who doesn't fit into their narrow definition of national identity.
And that's where it starts to get really concerning, right?
Yes.
Because that kind of thinking can easily lead to discrimination and persecution of minority groups.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And when you combine that with a disdain for democratic norms and institutions,
Mm-hmm.
it creates a very dangerous mix.
Right.
We've seen some populist leaders erode checks and balances on their power,
Okay.
attack the free press,
Oh, wow.
and undermine the independence of the judiciary.
That's pretty alarming. So it's not just about the rhetoric.
Yeah.
It's also about the actions they take to consolidate their power and silence dissent.
Precisely.
Wow.
And that's why it's so important to be vigilant and to recognize these patterns.
Right.
Populism itself isn't inherently bad.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a force for positive change, giving voice to those who feel marginalized or unheard.
Okay.
But when it's combined with authoritarian tendencies and a disregard for democratic principles, it can pose a serious threat to freedom and human rights.
So it's not just about labeling every populist movement as fascist, but rather about being aware of the potential for those tendencies to emerge and to hold leaders accountable for their actions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also important to recognize that fascism can manifest in different forms and adapt to different contexts.
Yeah.
We might not see the same symbols or uniforms as in the past,
Right.
but the core ideology of nationalism, authoritarianism, and the suppression of dissent can still be present, even in more subtle or disguised forms.
That's a really important point. It's like a chameleon that can change its colors to blend in with its surroundings.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the importance of critical thinking and media literacy.
Right.
We need to be able to see through the propaganda and the rhetoric to identify the underlying ideologies and motives at play.
It's about being informed and engaged citizens, right?
Right.
Not just passively consuming information, but actively questioning it and seeking out diverse perspectives.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's about recognizing that democracy is a fragile thing that requires constant vigilance and participation. We can't take our freedoms for granted or assume that they'll always be protected.
Well said. So we've talked about populist nationalism,
Right.
but are there other areas where we see echoes of fascism in the modern world?
Yes. One area that's particularly concerning is the resurgence of explicitly neo-fascist groups and ideologies.
I've heard about these groups. They seem to be gaining traction in some parts of the world. often exploiting social media and online platforms to spread their message.
That's right. They're often very savvy in their use of technology and propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
adapting their message to appeal to a younger audience or to exploit current events and social anxieties.
So they're not just rehashing old Nazi slogans,
Right.
but rather tailoring their message to fit into the modern political landscape?
Exactly.
Interesting.
They might not be wearing swastikas or marching in jackboots,
Right.
but their core beliefs are often rooted in white supremacy,
Okay.
ultranationalism,
Yeah.
and a deep hostility toward immigrants, minorities, and anyone they perceive as different.
It's a disturbing trend, and it's important to take it seriously.
Absolutely. These groups can incite violence and hatred, and their ideology poses a direct threat to democratic values and social cohesion.
It's like a cancer that can spread if we don't actively combat it.
That's a powerful image,
Yeah.
and it highlights the need for education, critical thinking, and a willingness to stand up against these dangerous ideologies.
It's not just about condemning them,
Right.
but also about understanding their appeal, right?
Yeah.
Figuring out why some people are drawn to these extremist views and addressing the underlying social and economic conditions that might be contributing to their rise.
That's a crucial point. We can't simply dismiss them as fringe lunatics.
Right.
We need to understand the factors that are fueling their growth and develop strategies to counter their narratives and their influence.
So it's a multifaceted challenge
Mm-hmm.
that requires a multifaceted response,
Yes,
but it's one we can't afford to ignore.
exactly.
Yeah.
The stakes are too high.
Yeah.
The lessons of history are clear. When we allow extremism and intolerance to fester, it can have devastating consequences.
It's a stark reminder of the importance of safeguarding our freedoms and standing up for our values.
It is.
But I'm curious, what can we do as individuals to combat these trends?
Yeah.
It can feel overwhelming, like we're just one small voice against a rising tide of extremism.
You're right, it can feel daunting. But I believe that individual actions, when combined with collective efforts, can make a real difference.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some practical steps we can take?
Well, first and foremost, we need to stay informed.
Mm-hmm.
Read widely,
Okay.
listen to diverse perspectives,
Yeah.
and be critical of the information you encounter, especially online.
So basically the opposite of what a fascist regime would want.
Yes.
They want a population that's passive, uninformed, and easily manipulated.
Precisely. An active and engaged citizenry is their worst nightmare.
Got it.
They thrive on ignorance and apathy.
So it's about being aware of the tactics they use to spread their message and to manipulate public opinion. But what else can we do beyond staying informed?
Well, don't underestimate the power of conversation.
Okay.
Talk to your friends and family about these issues.
Mhm.
Share information and challenge harmful stereotypes and prejudices when you encounter them.
So it's about having those difficult conversations, even when they're uncomfortable, and trying to bridge divides and foster understanding.
Exactly. And it's about supporting organizations and initiatives that are working to combat extremism, promote tolerance, and protect human rights.
That makes sense. So it's about using our voices, our resources, and our actions to create a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And it's about recognizing that democracy is not a spectator sport.
Right.
It requires active participation from all of us.
Okay.
Vote, engage in your community, hold your elected officials accountable, and never be afraid to speak out against injustice.
That's a powerful message. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in safeguarding our freedoms and building a better future.
And it's a reminder that even in the face of daunting challenges, hope is not lost.
Right?
As long as we remain vigilant, informed, and engaged,
Mm-hmm.
we can overcome these threats and build a world where freedom, tolerance, and human dignity prevail.
Those are words I think we can all get behind. This deep dive has been incredibly informative and thought-provoking.
Good.
It's given me a lot to reflect on and a renewed sense of purpose in terms of my own role as a citizen.
I'm glad to hear that. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Before we wrap up, I think it would be helpful to recap the key takeaways from our discussion.
Okay.
We started by defining fascism, exploring its historical origins, its core principles, and its devastating consequences.
We then shifted our focus to the present,
Uh-huh.
examining potential echoes of fascism in the modern world,
Right.
particularly the rise of populist nationalism and the resurgence of neo-fascist groups.
And we discussed the importance of being aware of these trends, recognizing the tactics used to spread these ideologies, and taking action to counter them.
It's been a comprehensive exploration of a complex and challenging topic.
It certainly has. And I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with us today.
You're welcome.
It's been an enlightening conversation.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these deep dives.
And I think our listeners will appreciate it as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to have these conversations and to grapple with these difficult issues. As we've been discussing the rise of fascism and its modern echoes, one thing that keeps coming to mind is the importance of recognizing the subtle signs.
Oh, yeah.
The seemingly small shifts can occur before a society fully embraces authoritarianism.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
It's not always about dramatic events
Right.
or overnight transformations. Often it's a gradual erosion of democratic norms and values, a slow creep towards authoritarianism that can be hard to detect if you're not paying close attention.
Okay, so what are some of those red flags? What are the subtle signs that we should be looking out for in our own societies?
Well, one of the most telling signs is a growing intolerance for dissent.
Okay.
When criticism of those in power is met with hostility or attempts to silence it,
Yeah.
that's a major red flag.
Yeah.
A healthy democracy thrives on debate and the free exchange of ideas.
So if we start seeing people being punished or ostracized for expressing unpopular opinions or challenging the status quo, that should raise alarm bells.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Another key sign is the erosion of press freedom.
Right.
A free and independent media is essential for holding those in power accountable and for informing the public. When governments start to control the narrative,
Yeah.
to manipulate information or to suppress dissenting voices in the media,
Okay.
that's a dangerous sign.
It's like those historical examples we discussed earlier where fascist regimes took control of the media and used it as a tool for propaganda.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it's not just about outright censorship. It can also be more subtle, like pressuring media outlets to self-censor or to avoid covering certain topics that might be critical of the government.
So we need to be wary of any attempts to undermine the credibility of the media or to paint journalists as enemies of the people.
Precisely.
Okay.
Another red flag is the weakening of independent institutions, like the judiciary
Right.
or election oversight bodies.
Yeah.
These institutions are essential for ensuring fairness, accountability, and the rule of law.
Right.
When they're undermined or packed with loyalists,
Okay.
it can pave the way for authoritarian rule.
It's like removing the safeguards that prevent a leader from accumulating too much power.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it's often done incrementally, step by step,
Right.
so that it doesn't seem as alarming at the time.
It's a slow boil, so to speak.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Another subtle sign is a growing emphasis on nationalism and the demonization of outsiders, or enemies. This can create a climate of fear and suspicion, making it easier to justify repressive measures.
We touched on that earlier when we were discussing populist nationalism. It's about creating an us versus them mentality.
Right,
So-
and it can be very effective at rallying support and silencing dissent.
Okay.
People are more likely to accept restrictions on their freedoms if they believe it's necessary for national security or to protect the country from a perceived threat.
It's like that old saying, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
That's a very apt quote.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that we need to be vigilant about protecting our freedoms, even when we're feeling afraid or insecure.
So it's about recognizing these subtle signs, these creeping forms of authoritarianism, and speaking out against them before it's too late.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's about supporting organizations and individuals who are working to defend democratic values and institutions.
It sounds like a lot of responsibility rests on the shoulders of individual citizens.
It does. But it's also empowering.
Okay.
We have more power than we often realize to shape our societies and to protect our freedoms.
So it's not just about being aware of the threats, but also about taking action, about being engaged citizens.
Absolutely. And it can start with small things like having those difficult conversations with friends and family, supporting organizations that align with your values, or simply staying informed and engaged in the political process.
It's about recognizing that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation from all of us.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that the fight for freedom and human rights is never truly over. It's an ongoing struggle that requires constant vigilance and effort.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. It's given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners.
I hope so too. It's been a pleasure discussing these important issues with you.
And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive into fascism.
Okay.
We've explored its historical origins, its core principles, its devastating consequences, and its potential echoes in the modern world.
Right.
We've also discussed the importance of recognizing the subtle signs of authoritarianism,
Yes.
the need for vigilance and active citizenship,
Mm-hmm.
and the power of individual actions to make a difference.
Yeah.
Remember, folks, knowledge is power. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop questioning.
And never give up hope. The future's not predetermined. We have the power to shape it.
Until next time, keep diving deep.